I will begin chairing the meeting. If we could all stand to pledge the flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. I do have an electronic confirmation stating that we are in accordance with the open meeting. And we'll begin. I would like to introduce that we do have members of the school committee and the school department here from the region, and members of the Gloucester Town Council present. There are no public comments. So we will begin with. There is one? Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, there is one. We have Palmer Moore from Plymouth. Were you just signing in?
Yes.
Okay, you don't have any comments?
No.
Okay. Thank you. We have the minutes of April 28th.
I'd like to make a motion to accept the minutes of April 28, 2016.
Second.
Discussion? Hearing none, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed?
I would like to make a motion to accept the minutes for May 12, 2016.
Second.
Discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? We move on to the warrants. Payroll warrant number 45.
I would like to make a motion to accept payroll warrant number 45 in the amount of $30,921.22.
Second.
Discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed?
I would like to make a motion to accept payroll warrant number 46 in the amount of $30,083.27.
Second.
Discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? General warrant number 20.
I would like to make a motion to accept general warrant number 20 in the amount of $36,884.07.
Second.
Discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Monthly reports.
I would like to make a motion to approve the following to accept the following monthly reports. Our building and zoning report for April 2016. The Department of Public Works report for April 2016. Finance Department report for April 2016. Department of Human Services for April 2016. Planning Department April 2016 report. The Police Department April 2016 report. The Tax Assessors report for March 2016 and for April 2016, and Rhode Island Resource Recovery for April 2016.
Second that motion.
Discussion. I do have, I just wanted to point out that there's going to be a charity car show sponsored by the Rhode Island Cowboy Cruisers. And there'll be one June 4th at Helen's Place. There was one May 8th and May 14th, but there will be, and they're collecting non-perishable food donations at these events. Any other discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? We'll move on to quarterly reports.
Make a motion that we accept the quarterly reports from the Foster Conservation Commission, Libraries of Foster, the Foster Recreation Committee, and the Tax Board review.
Second.
Could I make one comment? We did get the canvassers, but I didn't get it, came just after the packets were done, so that will be in the next monthly meeting packet.
Thank you. Anyone second report?
I did.
Thank you. Discussion?
Mayor, is the school, paying school going?
It's not in there.
That may have been in last time. These were the ones that
Oh, okay, all right.
They're not listed, so. They were due in April, these were due in April, and so they're here now. I did have a question, I don't know if anybody from the conservation or maybe someone on the council could assist me. I noticed on the town council liaison for the Forster Conservation Commission, it notes that Todd Charlie, who is the liaison, reported the town council requested the fence be put up around the new trees. I don't recall having that discussion. I'm assuming it's the trees that American chestnuts, which, I was just, I have no objections to that, but I just thought maybe I'm forgetting something.
They have, I don't recall any discussion.
Okay. All right, and I had one other on the recreation committee. The recreation committee is still looking for new members. They're looking especially for someone who has grant writing expertise. So, just wanted to make a note of that. Any other discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, so we'll move on to old business. And the first is the tax treaty, which we have here. And Mr. Estivo, you were a part of that subgroup, if you will, for discussion about this.
Yeah.
Would you like to present it or discuss it?
Sure. So, so the actual agreement, I believe, is still being worked out. We just recently sent back a number of edits to it in the past week. So I'm not sure that there's an actual contract that everyone's agreed to that's ready to be signed. But as I understand it, Nexamp had put forth their original proposal, which was payment of $6,250 per year over 20 years. Town had proposed approximately $8,500 based on a formula that took into account the cost of the panels. We did request an appraisal report to appraise the total value of the system.
They came in at $2,655,000, is that right?
That's correct, yeah. So the appraisal came back valuing the entire system at a little over $2.5 million. So that amount applied with our current tangible tax rate would have resulted in taxes in the first year of about $74,000. So there was a large discrepancy. It's worth noting that the state is perennially and apparently still actively discussing. I've heard rumors maybe renewable energy systems entirely tax exempt. I haven't heard those rumors confirmed, but I have received confirmation that they're looking at passing a rate based on the number of kilowatt hours the system produces, as opposed to the value. And I believe we applied what the most recent proposal was to the size of this system, and it worked out to, I think, fairly close to the $6,350 figure.
I would have one question for the solicitor on this. Let's say we go into a contract, a written 20-year contract. Present it, we get approval for it, we sign a contract, and then the legislature makes it tax exempt. Are they binding by the contract, or are they binding by the new? What I'm trying to say is that there's a time frame. Once we come in and sign a contract, and then it's changed at the state legislature, that should be a binding contract, correct?
It depends on how the legislature creates the law. If they show preemption,
You got a hand up too.
yeah, if they show preemption, you got an argument, there's an argument whether it's binding or not. We have always, the law has always said that if you do if you sign a contract, that contract stands, period. But as you've seen with other things in legislation, sometimes they undo it.
And again, it could be a word to the wise, if anybody puts a bill in, you could say, listen, we've got a contract, and
Absolutely.
we've got a budget, and we're counting on, you can't all of a sudden pull the rug out from underneath us, so.
That would be your delegation.
Yes.
And I'm sure there's other communities that would be in the same situation. Again, so normally my answer is absolutely, your contract is binding, but we've all seen situations where they write legislation and then turn around and say, no.
So if this is the case, we may have a ticking clock to maybe get into an agreement, like it or not.
So one of the ways that we tried in the contract to address that is through completely exempting taxes, saying that taxes are entirely exempt on the entire system. The payments that are being made under the agreement are payments in lieu of taxes that have the same effect as taxes. The town has the same remedies for non-payment as they do if they weren't taxes, but definitionally, they're not taxes. And so there, we did try to get around that. To your point, I think that we don't have too much to lose in terms of what the proposal from Nexamp was versus what the state is considering. It doesn't seem like they're considering that in this session anymore. So the most recent counter, what we most recently went back with was basically double, $12,700 a year. And 4 payments of $10,000 each over the next 4 years, starting in 2017, to the Foster Land Trust, which I put in there because I thought it helped offset maybe some concerns about farmland being put towards a more industrial use, but also, and I thought it might be easier to swallow from that perspective because those are tax deductible. Well, those are just being.
And I would agree that that's certainly a way to take it out of the realm of, state legislation.
Another concern of mine is that if, for the sake of a better word, if we make it too expensive for them, they'll walk to another town that's cheaper.
That's the threat.
Well, no, it ain't, it's the truth. I mean, if I can go 3 miles up the street, up the hill to Situate, which is less than 3 miles, at half the price, I'm a businessman. I'd be crazy not to. So I've seen where this town is faulted on business. We have no businesses because a lot of part was, hey, this is what we need, this is the parameters, and yeah, we'll go somewhere else. So, I mean, you gotta, it's a negotiation thing. I'd hate to chase them all away and all of a sudden, everybody's reeling all kinds of revenue in, and we're getting house lot popped in. Because now we're banging the homeowners, because we don't have revenue coming in that could have been from a solar farm, and then all of a sudden, house values are dropping. It's just, it's a fine line.
And to that point, I think just from a negotiating perspective, Nexamp, again, just speaking candidly, is at a bit of a disadvantage in that they have a deadline by which they need to get open. They've gone through a very lengthy process with the town so far.
And I do want to ask this question, are they already putting the frame rails up? Is that the actual property? So they've got a financial commitment there, which I think on their part might have been a little bit
They
dangerous.
spent a lot of time and effort and money already.
If they're already putting the frame rails up to hold the solar panels.
I don't think it's a deal breaker, a
Right.
few thousand.
I'd like to recognize Mrs. Moreau.
As far as your question about the legislator with the making everything exempt, from what I'm hearing from the legislative committee, from the Assessors Association, is they will not make the contracts null and void. They were gonna put that, they said they were gonna put that in there once they get this all together. Because there's too many towns that have contracts, and they've had them for a few years now, so.
Let's say they do this next year. So, I mean, there may be a ticking clock here. Maybe not, it ain't gonna happen this year. The clock may be ticking. Now, you put them in a position where, you know what, if we hold off 12 months,
Right. Yeah, and I don't think that it's fair to Nexamp to wait any longer. I think we need to move along.
I don't wanna lose it and all of a sudden they wanna run the clock down and push legislation next year and get tax exempt.
John has done the majority of this with the town hall staff, and I think you're pretty close, right? You're very close.
Well, I will say that,
Close
I don't
to
think,
double
I don't think that Nexamp's had really an opportunity to fully look at all the changes we recently sent over, and I don't believe we've gotten a comment back. It was done relatively recently, but.
Mrs. King?
I just wanted to speak to those. There were 2 separate sort of bills. The bill to totally exempt solar installations as a manufacturing facility was held for further study back in February, and so is unlikely to come up during this legislative session. The bill to set a standard for all towns to have a certain rate per kilowatt hour is actually in the governor's bill, and so will likely pass this legislative session. It has gone through so many iterations that the Office of Energy Resources has stopped paying attention to what exactly they're proposing, but they did tell me that there should be language in there that stays in there that grandfathers in existing contracts.
So again,
That would make this legislation,
Right,
and
so-
that would make any negotiations null and void, because if it's not agreed upon by then, it'll be a set standard that the state, the governor passed, that this is what you're gonna get, like it or not.
And Juliana, do you recall what the difference was under the current proposed amount in?
Right, so the most recent that I heard of with the kilowatt hour was $5 per kilowatt hour, and for this next amp, that would come out to $5,625. Also for a point of reference, I just quickly calculated per their contract, and Palmer can speak to whether this is accurate or not with my math. I did the projected annual energy output, at least for the first 2 years, by the price that National Grid guaranteed them per megawatt hour, and it came to about $353,000.
So,
Yes,
so
per
that
year.
would be about, other than what they first offered, that'd be 1,000 and something less than the original if the bill passes. So,
Mrs. Ryder.
Is this the one on Theodore Foster Drive?
Yes.
If I remember correctly, the contract with National Grid was for 15 years,
It's
and they want a tax treaty for 20.
It's a
Why?
20-year contract.
Hmm?
No, it's not.
It's a 15-year.
Right, but why would they want a tax treaty for 20?
I think that lines up with the depreciation schedule, is that?
Yes.
fine?
Yeah, it does. And most solar panels usually they last longer, but most of them is about 20 years.
We did in our most recent redraft change it to 15, but again, these terms haven't been necessarily agreed upon.
Mr. Moore.
I just wanted to clarify, because sometimes the units of measure in this get a little confusing. So the amendments to Article 18 that were heard yesterday, addressing renewable energy taxation and standardization across the state. The benchmark that's been put forward are really two things. It's the average of any agreements that were entered into from the period 2011 to 2016. A lot of those data points I included in the original proposal that was presented to Town Council. And then the other benchmark is a standard $5 per kilowatt AC. So it doesn't have anything to do with the output of the system, it's everything to do with its size. But I think the net result is somewhat similar in that they're basing it on the AC capacity, which for a solar project is smaller than the DC capacity. So we've put forward our proposal in terms of kilowatts DC or megawatts DC. The standardization benchmark will be based on megawatts AC. So again, it would end up being about 5,000 and change per year for the state, the rulemaking process is being established.
Mr. Spazio.
And Mr. Restivo, I hadn't heard that anything about the money going to the land trust before, and I think this is a bad idea. The land trust continues to take land off the tax rolls. A lot of it is very buildable land, but a lot of it are old farms, and probably will be kept in old farms, and all the land they have, they can't take care of now. So I really think that's a poor idea. I think the town could use whatever, $4,000, a lot more to offset our budget than giving them more money to take more land off the tax rolls, which increases everybody's taxes in this room. They think in their minds, they're doing great work for Foster, protecting it from homeowners, homes being built, but in the end, they're costing us a ton of money with the Water Board, the Nature Conservancy, the Audubon Society, and the rest of the people that take land off our tax rolls. Thank you.
I do note at the bottom, it does state that a vote should be after we discuss it with the solicitor as to whether we can take a vote tonight.
Well, first of all, you don't even have an agreement, you don't have a final agreement. But that was noted because our charter is purely, we go to the financial town meeting with anything that has to do with taxes, but that final agreement may not put it there, one, and two is that's why you see us writing the tax stabilization ordinance to allow that without that in the future, but we're not there yet.
We're not there yet.
I would like to speak to the 1,000. I did notice that, it kind of stuck out to me. I would rather see, and again, too much of anything is a tipping point. We do have a lot of land out here that is, in my neighborhood, I'll just mention a few. When we Dunbar Acres is now, I've got probably 400 to 500 acres behind me that's in community conservation land trust on Kennedy Road. It's quite a lot, and all of that has been taken off the tax rolls. I think 10,000 going to that, we would be better served going to offset taxes of the community versus the land trust. They're doing pretty good between all the entities that he mentioned. They have a lot of land tied up in this town that's not going to be developed. And then you add on Providence Water Supply Board that has over 2,000 acres in this town that will not be built on. Although they do pay taxes, it can be counted on that it's really not going to be developed. And they continue to buy more. So the more they buy, the more does it come off the tax roll. So I think 40,000 over 20 years, I think that'd be better off to offset the taxes.
This is right.
Well, I would urge the town not, certainly not to go below 12,000. That is, as 12,000, that's 1/6 of what the town, would be taking in if there was no tax treaty and the state didn't do anything. Also, this does not provide the town with any service, and it doesn't provide any jobs. And at this point in time, nobody's gonna walk when they put that amount of investment in there. So I would urge you, minimum 12,000. Other than that, it would just be ludicrous.
I'd like to also put out there, there's always two sides of the spectrum. If the deal breaks down and they walk away, that land right now is agricultural residential. In order for it to be built on, it would have to be a 4.75 acre lot. As it sits right now in open space, it's probably bringing in over 15 to 20 years, less than $2,000 or $3,000 current revenue with no services to the town, not providing any jobs. Falls through, guy puts a house on it, 3 kids in the school system, didn't provide any jobs, but now it's a demand on the service. I hate to see that attitude say, I'd stick with the 12,000, you don't like it, go somewhere else, because we've got some money to be made, hundreds of thousands of dollars over 15 or 20 years versus $300 or $400 as it's currently getting right now.
And to that point, I think there's a good example of why I think this particular project is distinguishable from the other project that I know is being considered, which concerns land in the corridor that
Correct.
we have targeted for commercial development, whereas this is land that's sort of, there wouldn't be generating, there's no lost opportunity here. So I was admittedly, I think, sort of shocked by the low figure that was initially proposed because
Which is to be expected.
yeah, I think with such an expensive, large revenue-producing system, you would expect that the taxes would at least be higher than, and I wouldn't be surprised if $6,250 was close to the average residential rate.
And you did put in agreements in other towns, West Greenwich, 20,000 plus cost of living in lieu of property and tangible taxes on 1.6.
And that's another thing that's in lieu of the property taxes as well. This is just the tangible taxes. So, I mean, definitely the $12,000 is on the high end compared to other communities. But, I mean, make no mistake, the only real benefit that I see to having this in the town of Foster is revenue. And because there's really no job creation, and the environmental benefits are felt globally, they're not felt locally.
And what I'm trying to say is the town needs revenue.
Right. So it's definitely a balance.
You've got Gloucester here considering 5,000 megawatt flat fee. East Providence, total of 76,000 in lieu of property tax and tangible in the form of a lease of 3 megawatt. Richmond, 3,750 in lieu of taxes. So our number of 12 is pretty high to them, and yet their number is kind of in the ballpark. So So we gotta meet somewhere in the middle. I just hate to see something lost, but it may be settled by the governor's enactment.
Well, Ms. King.
I just want to say, in the off chance that it either doesn't pass this legislative session or it just changes again drastically, which I suppose it could, I would say that if the council decides they want to go with a higher number than what is proposed by Nexamp, just respectfully request that the council takes a look at the calculations that were included in the packet. It was basically taking a number of different scenarios, depreciating it by the 20-year schedule, and then either stabilizing it over 15 or 20 years. Because this, I mean, Nexamp unfortunately has turned into the guinea pig in Foster for this particular type of thing. And whatever, you guys decide to go with is probably how it would be applied to the next
Or
solar
it could be the
company.
canary in the coal mine.
Yeah, that comes in, so, like, just having a process that's followed the same way each time is a good thing to do.
Thank you. So, Mr. Estivo, we're going to put this on a future agenda item and hopefully have it for the next meeting, maybe?
Yeah, hopefully, I think we can get this done before the next one.
Thank you for your work, I mean,
Yeah.
pretty good.
Great, thank you.
Good job.
I prefer Pioneer.
You got the.
Yes. Oh, I'm sorry.
I just wanted to make a couple quick comments. So my name is Palmer Moore, and I work with Nexamp and represent the project. And I certainly thank the council members and everyone else here. There's been a lot of folks that have been involved in this process. It's been a very long process. As was highlighted, we're in the enviable position of being in construction and not having this tax agreement executed. A lot of that circulated around two things. One was just obviously wanting to work patiently with the town on developing an ordinance and going through the various approval processes that came out of that, and giving people time to understand as we're the guinea pig, right? So we know this is new and wanted to make sure everyone was comfortable with it. And two, we had to start upgrades with the utility over a year ago because of the timeframes that they give us to build out some of the upgrades they're doing. So some of the things that you might not be aware of that this project did already bring to this town is the fact that this triggered National Grid to review their infrastructure in the area of Theodore Foster Drive, and they actually ended up replacing all of the infrastructure along Theodore Foster Drive. It was very old, three-phase, subject to being knocked out in storms. They replaced it with a much higher resiliency aluminum wire of a certain spec to survive tree strikes and so forth. They're presently upgrading the substation on Chopmist Hill and making that more resilient so it can flow both ways. This is sort of what these projects are forcing the utilities to look at. So as we, as a community and as a region, start to make our grid more able to be adaptable and flexible and do things differently going forward than sort of the status quo that we exist in today, all these upgrades are necessary. And that one was done by the project, which, if there had been no project, would eventually be done by all of us, the ratepayers. And so that's private investment going into the infrastructure that we otherwise would have seen on all of our electric bills. So there's some things behind the scenes that are hard to see, but have already actually happened because of this project. Obviously, we've got a lot of construction jobs going on there now. Our contractors head out and get lunch, get coffee daily at the local stores. It's a temporary construction job. There's no sugarcoating that. But the good thing is that we've started developing relationships with contractors in Rhode Island and in the region who are now going to go out and do more of these. There's only going to be more of these projects. So they're getting trained up and getting the skill set necessary to go out and do more of these projects. We are at a point now where, although we're in construction, we haven't closed all of our financing yet. And this tax agreement is very important to us to be able to do that. Because of all the timing issues that this project faced, we're left now with some open-ended items, and this tax agreement being one of them. So I just want to point out a couple things, and I totally agree with everything that's been said here. I want to make it clear that I think the number was put out there, $74,000 if this was taxed at the standard commercial rate. And I just want everyone to make sure they understand that it's not the difference between 74 and 6. It's the difference between what we're proposing and zero, because we wouldn't, no project would get built, it just couldn't support those taxes. So we've got, these tax agreements are 100% necessary to make these projects work financially. It's not unique to solar, it's not like it's a green energy thing. You look at Burrillville, they have the power plant that was there, they're now entertaining a very controversial new one. But they had a tax stabilization agreement. I included that in the proposal just so everyone could see that, you know, we're not some special energy producer. They had a tax agreement that basically at the end of the day worked out to very close to what we proposed. So this isn't unique to solar. It is necessary to get these projects financed. We actually are in the early stages of developing another project right immediately next door to this one. The great thing is that, again, it's out of sight, out of mind. It's a cleared field. It's not going to have any negative impact on the sort of rural character, obviously. It's reusing a lot of the infrastructure upgrades that we already did. And if the tax rates are what is being proposed at this point, we'll just know, I mean, I'm just being factual about it. I'm an engineer, I'm not a negotiator, so I'm terrible at this, but that project dies tomorrow. I mean, we just can't make the numbers work. The numbers basically don't work now. We're getting very aggressive with all the inputs that we're putting in it just to try to make it work. But the numbers that we're kicking around now, there's no way the numbers will work, and we'll just have to walk away from that one. So we want to work with the town. We want to come up with something that's fair, as been discussed here. The state's coming up with a benchmark. That benchmark is right in line, actually less than the proposal that we built off of data set that we had. You know, we want to be a great neighbor, and we want to support the town, and we're not asking anything in return. We just, you know, we know that it's only fair that a project like this generate tax revenue because this town chose to host those types of projects when they're approved and when they're properly cited. So I just ask for the council's consideration, the public's consideration when evaluating these things, and I look forward to continuing to work with the council, hopefully expeditiously on a mutual agreement that benefits everyone.
Thank you, Mr. Walker. So again, Mr. Steele, you're going to continue to work with Mrs. Bevelak, the assessor and finance director.
Yep.
And thank you. So our next item is the review of the Gloucester resolutions. I know not everyone from the Gloucester Town Council is here, and Mr. Lewis isn't here, so I would entertain moving that down further and looking at C and possibly D prior to old business B.
I'll make that motion. Move to rearrange the agenda so that the Gloucester resolutions concerning the regional school system are heard after the planning board recommendation for charter amendments.
You have a second?
Second. Thank you, Mrs. Bevelak. Okay, so we'll move on to the charter review. No, if you want that. Thank you. Discussion on that? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, so now we will move on. Thank you, Mrs. Bevelak. We will move on to the Charter Review Commission report. Do you have a motion?
I make a motion that we review the presented plan revisions for the charter, from the Charter Review Commission.
Second?
Okay. Discussion.
Want to go over them?
Do you want to, well, we need to schedule a public hearing. And do you want to go over each one of them now, or do you
No.
want to present them all?
They could change
Right.
during the public hearing.
Yeah.
And are we willing to present all of them to the public hearing?
Let's see why not, if we need to
I would
call
think that
some
that
out,
would
we can do
be,
it at that time.
right, I would think that that'd be appropriate.
I mean, you did your work, you brought them forward, I don't
Mhm.
think
I think that would only
it's
be.
correct to bring them forward in a public hearing.
Mhm. Any other discussion?
I should probably have to change my motion to.
Yes.
This is my third charter review, and this group put in more work diligently Jane, I don't know how many times, and Ms. Bevilacqua, our attorney. So the things that have moved forward to you were really discussed long and hard, and I think represent the best things we could do. So hopefully, I would hope that you guys have them in your hand. I would hope that here's some questions tonight, but we'll sit the way we are and wait for the public.
Public hearing.
What I find is the same thing gets discussed twice,
All right.
that's happened before. So if somebody would remove their second, I will remove my motion and revise it to a correct.
Withdraw my second.
I'll rewrite the main motion. I'd like to make a motion to present the Charter Review Commission's report to the public hearing to the public for a public hearing. What date?
June 23rd, I believe is the date.
For June 23rd, 7 PM.
Could you just, we're not really presenting the report as much as each of the
Public
ordinances.
hearing.
It's a public hearing,
All right, so.
or charter, I'm sorry,
It's a
charter
charter-
changes.
charter change.
So let's keep the motion not about the report necessarily, because that doesn't matter, but about each of those articles, the articles that will be.
All right, the motion would be to present the articles. I don't have to go over each one of them, do I? Just the article
No.
presented for a public hearing, to the public for a public hearing on June 23rd, 7 PM.
Second.
Discussion. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay. Thank you. We also have before us a request from the planning board in regards to the charter amendment and requesting it to be part of the public hearing on June 23rd, also regarding capital funds transfer. Do we have a motion for that?
Is it gonna be at the same time? Is that what you want at the same time?
Well, we need to, whether we want to accept
I
this
would-
recommendation.
Actually, I like the idea. I thought when it came through the charter review, it didn't. But I would like to make a motion to accept the planning board's proposal to be decided at a public hearing for amendments for the amendment on the charter, the same date, June 23rd at 7 PM.
Second.
Discussion.
And we got down to, how many do we have in front of you? 8, okay? This amendment that they're putting forward was discussed a long, long time, many nights, and we chose not to move it forward. If you remember, most of the charter things that have come before the public, the more they have to read, the more they have to deal with. If they don't like one, and it gets a lot of bad press, or what we call Preston Foster, which is just word of mouth, they all go down. So I think very hard and long about adding another one. That's up to you.
I think it's important that this moves forward. I don't think it's gonna be a big issue, there being 8 or 9. I think there's a lot on there, but going from 8 to 9, I don't think it's a big
Well,
issue.
could the charter review committee have this particular proposal sent to the members of the charter review committee so we know what we're talking about that night?
We have copies here tonight, if you'd like copies.
But not every member is here tonight.
Right. So we
And
will-
Patrick, it has to be mailed to Patrick, so maybe the clerk could send it out if she would. Thank you.
Would that be all right, Jane? Thank you. And I do, I see no harm with it being part of our
I don't need.
public hearing, and then we can see from there. Okay, any further discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Well, now we're at the point where we do need to address the resolutions that are before us from Gloucester. The first one being the removing of capital expenditures from maintenance of effort. Do we have a motion for discussion purposes?
that the first one up in the front, this one here?
Yes, it's resolution 2016-7.
So I make a motion for discussion. I don't want to make a motion, just to present and discuss. I make a motion to present and discuss the proposed resolution 2016-07.
Second.
Okay, so discussion. This one is in regards to removing capital expenditures from maintenance. We did receive the resolution from Gloucester, and at the time that it was first presented, we tabled it to invite Gloucester. The school committee was present at that time, and they asked to attend, and we wanted to give an opportunity to our finance department to review this. So, Mrs. Ryder, you have a question?
No, could you just give us the Cliff Note version?
The Cliff Note version
Yeah.
of this? Okay. Gloucester, would you like to give the Cliff Note version then?
Sure.
One happy. This is something that goes back, by the way, Steve Setty, Gloucester Town Council. This is something that goes back a number of years. It goes back to, I think, even when the ESCO discussion was going on at one point as to how the debt on the ESCO was going to be determined, and would it be as part of capital expense, or would it be a part of the operating expense? And since it's moved forward, it's also gone into, about 4 years ago, I believe, there was a capital lease that was paid off, basically, during 1 year. And unfortunately, what seemed to have happened is that the debt that was paid off was never removed from the budget. Now, traditionally, when we assume debt, within our communities, we have a debt schedule, we pay the debt schedule off, and that falls off your, as far as any appropriation that you need to make going forward. In these cases, in the case of the school district, by leaving that as part of, or that becomes still remaining in the operational budget, even though the debt is paid off, it becomes part of the maintenance of effort, so it inflates the overall operating budget, that the regional school district has. We also have debt, other normal debt that, at some point, we look at the debt schedule, it falls off, and that's going to happen. But this resolution basically just clarifies that in these situations, that once debt is paid, and once it's determined as debt, and there's definitions by the GFOA that constitute what is debt. If it falls into those categories, once it's paid off, it's off the books, so it's not part of the maintenance of effort, but goes away as if as if it was just debt like we're normally used to seeing, and what we would normally do in our normal way of budget.
Following up on that, Ted Willigan from the council. Back a few years ago, we had a point of discussion with the regional district, with the financial town meeting, when before we used to have operations as a separate vote and debt service as a separate vote. Now, we all knew that the debt service had to be paid, but the issue was always in operations. Then at one point, there was a decision or ruling by a solicitor that said, we're going to have one vote that couples them all together. And our argument was that, well, the debt service shouldn't be like a maintenance of effort, be included in maintenance of effort, no different than when you pay off your mortgage. You don't keep budgeting the same amount for the same purpose. And you take the advantage of having a lower cost. So what happened was, we were not able to persuade the region and legal counsel at that time to separate the two. So we filed a bill with the legislature to ask them to consider it. So we went down and, there was a bill introduced. And what eventually they decided was they accepted our argument. And what they did decide was rather than have a separate bill for Foster and Gloucester, they recognized the application statewide. So they put it in the budget, so it became a rule for all districts and all people to make sure that debt service was not considered as part of maintenance of effort. So this is one more step toward that, because we've got to recognize that when the bill is paid for your mortgage or debt service, it should come out. No different than if you have a capital item. It's got to, by definition, I think RISE determines what's capital and what's not capital, and that's okay. But if you have a capital item in there, then the next year, that item should come out as a line item once you paid for it. Now, if there's maintenance involved for that capital item, well, that's maintenance expense, and we understand that. But that would go into maintenance expense, as opposed to having a line item stay as a capital item. So that's a piece of this whole picture, to try and be sure that from an operational point of view, we have the operations defined properly, and we don't have apples and oranges in there. So that's one of the elements behind this.
Thank you. John, I just wanted to fill you in as to where we were. We had a motion, and it was seconded for discussion purposes, the acceptance of this resolution, and that's where we are in the middle of it.
Thank you. I apologize for my tardiness. I had graduation at the college, which I'm required to attend by my contract. I got here as soon as I could.
So, any other further discussion? You have anything you want to say?
Did you want me to? I read the bill itself, and the only problem I have with it, because
We're discussing the resolution, though, we're not discussing the bill, according to our agenda. So I just want to make sure that that's, I guess I'll ask the solicitor.
Are you kind of referring to the bill, the General Assembly?
that that they want to vote on, exactly.
Okay. That this resolution is requesting modified?
Right.
Okay.
The modifications in the bill, the way it's worded, the one problem I have with it is it indicates that they're removing it from budgeting purposes as well. And if you don't budget for capital, it's as if it's saying that there will not be any budget for long-term capital assets. Long-term being anything that exceeds 1 year. So from a planning perspective, there's best practices, there's acceptable practices, and then there's just poor practices, and that really falls under the poor practice. And that's for one thing. And the second thing is for housing aid, you have to have an adopted plan. You have to have an approved plan. So by not having an approved adopted plan for capital purchases that might be eligible for housing aid reimbursement and part of that program, you've now eliminated their ability to include those expenditures in a program such as that, because you're not going to meet the standards for the program. And that's the literal wording of the bill. That's my understanding of it. It's not their intention. I can clearly see it's not the intention of the bill, but it says that it will be removed from all annual budgets. Well, from an annual budget means that they're not going to budget for capital. So I don't understand why it can't be budgeted and still not part of your maintenance of effort. Still excluded from the maintenance of effort, which it should be.
Okay.
Right, it should be excluded from maintenance of effort. I agree, we all agree, it meets your long-term goals, which is to have some control over their capital spending and the fluctuation, et cetera. But the way it's worded is that it would not be part of any budget, of any annual budget. If it's not part of any annual budget, then how can you say that they have a plan that's adopted for capital? And how will you meet the standards for housing aid reimbursement and housing aid programs? I mean, it might be made, but that was my interpretation.
Kelly, when you say your interpretation of
The
the
bill.
resolution's language or of the bill?
The bill.
The
that was my
resolution
question.
is asking that they're supporting this change, I believe is what they're doing. And the change itself, the problem I have with the change itself is that, in its literal sense, it's asking that it be excluded from all budgeting.
If I could just interrupt, not everyone on the council has a copy of the bill.
Okay.
So
I actually
I'm not
researched the
sure.
bill, I'm sorry.
Are you referring to this language where it says, nor shall any non-recurring capital expense as defined in government accounting, auditing, and financial reporting definitions be included in the annual budget? Yeah, so that's on the,
Right, that's on the back
Part of the
page, right?
resolution.
But Kelly was referring to the bill, and I know not everyone on the council has a copy of the
But that's
bill,
the language
so I didn't want there
specifically,
to be confusion. But on the back of the resolution from Foster, it does state operating versus.
This is what they're asking us to consider.
Yes.
It was basically not written by us, but for us. And what you're arguing is the effect of this language that we are to
yes.
favor or tell
Right.
legislators.
I understand the intent, and I understand, and that's my view of its literal meaning. That's my understanding of its literal.
can we ask the council, is that what the intention of that language?
No, it's not not to restrict. I agree that they need to have a capital plan for a housing need, but this was more to, basically, I think you have to go through the next couple of words in that, in the amendment where it says, nor shall any non-recurring capital expenses defined, by governmental accounting, auditing, and financial reporting definitions be included in the annual budget or in the maintenance of effort of any school district. In other words, basically what it's saying is that what the amendment is asking is that these things are not included as an operational expense, but it is a capital expense. And for the purposes set forth, non-recurring capital lease payments shall be considered non-recurring debt service. That's what the language is. So, it's not intended to restrict capital, capital expenditures and, a plan for capital expenditures. There's a plan in place now where, over a 5-year period, capital debt would be reimbursed, provided it's approved by RIDE and so forth. So, that you have to have a plan in place in order to get the housing need reimbursement. This in no way does anything to restrict housing need at all.
I think that building, a good example of that was that, in our last referendum, we were approached by the school committee and RIDE to come up with a 5-year plan to, refurbish the schools, and to come up, and it was a 35% reimbursement as part of that whole program. So what we did was, in collaboration with the school committee agreed that they were going to contribute $300,000 a year for 5 years, and the town council from surplus, and the town council was going to, from their surplus, the non-school surplus, contribute $300,000 a year for the 5 years, which was like $3 million in total over the 5 years, which was going to be reimbursable to the extent of 35%, which meant we would obviously get more than $3 million worth of capital improvements done. So we put that forward, as a capital plan, and that rocks solid in terms of the definition, because it's capital improvements to the infrastructure for the schools. So we just got to be sure that we keep the operations separate from the capital, and in no way would the $3 million commitment over the 5-year period be considered part of operations capital, and we define it as that, and that makes it eligible for the housing reimbursement or reimbursement for this program RIDE's put together.
Kelly, how would you do you mind if I continue with this, and then on the next one, you can,
That's fine.
I'll hand over?
That's
Okay,
fine.
thank you. Kelly, how would you prefer this wording so that it jives with what, we know what you're looking for, but evidently it's an accounting.
I don't know why they're switching the word from operating to annual, first of all, because an annual budget would indicate almost any annual budget versus an operating budget, which is the general fund budget, which is really what they're basing the maintenance of effort on, for the most part. I understand exactly what he's saying, but in that plan, the very next year, with that first $300,000, they budgeted it somewhere. I'll guarantee that $300,000 is included in somebody's budget. So I just don't understand, I understand the whole maintenance of effort, I understand that, and I get that that was the intent, I just don't think the wording accomplishes that. That's basically my problem with it. They're saying that it would be excluded from an annual budget. I just, so if you make a long-term plan and you adopt a long-term plan, you're not going to present a legally binding budget to stay on that plan, or to follow through on that plan, or to fund that plan. It's the wording. The concept is what you would want. It's exactly what you want. In fact, it's the wording, and I don't know. I don't believe that's the literal meaning behind the bill.
I know we have a few educators in here.
And I'm not a lawyer, so I mean, I don't want to say, but
Could I just recognize Dr. Bonds at this time? Dr. Bonds?
Two things. One, I want to hand you a copy of the bill and you can pass this around. Because the resolution made some language changes, and then the resolution specifically called for the legislators to put forward a bill. So the bill that you have before you is the bill that Representative Chippendale submitted to the House, and those bills were testified on, and hearings were had on that bill. The one bill was testified on April 28th, the other one was testified on May 5th. I have to look, the two bills being considered tonight have already been submitted to the legislature. They've already had hearings on them in the House for the two bills that you're considering this evening. And the Senate was considering the companion version of those bills this evening.
May I just interject? At this time, I believe it was asked to be tabled until Foster and the school committee came up with their own resolutions to either to support Gloucester's resolution. So it was not heard at completely.
Correct. So in the House side, it was heard. In the Senate side, Senator Fogarty did request this evening that it be tabled for further consideration, and he did make reference. One of our school committee members went to testify, that's why I know. He did make reference to the fact that there were not resolutions yet passed by both councils, so he requested that the legislature table it.
And that was the same with the House.
I don't know the reason why it was tabled on the House. I didn't have anyone present. I just know that testimony was made by the School Committees Association and the Superintendent's Association as well, a representative. So this bill, if you look on page 2, which is the underlined text at the top of page 2, is the reference that Kelly was making reference to, and Mr. Estevo as well, it says, may not be included in the annual budget, so it's like the 5 slides down, annual budget, or in the maintenance of effort. And whether or not that was the intent, that's the current language, and our attorney had interpreted it the same way, that it would require not, you couldn't even budget for it. And what that would mean, for example, is we just received on May 17th approval for the project we submitted for Forster, and for the projects that were submitted for Gloucester, and the projects that were submitted for the region. That would be a $1.9 million reimbursement in state aid that we would not be eligible to receive if we couldn't budget for it. That's at the region. The town of Forster and the town of Gloucester have corresponding amounts as well. And just to be crystal clear, I want people to understand, a 5-year capital plan sets aside a pool of money. So I want to understand both budgeting and maintenance of effort. For example, you have in your charter 2% set aside every year. So every single year you have 2% set aside for capital. One year you do a road. The next year you use that exact same 2% for a bridge. The next year you use that exact same 2% for a fire truck. But every single year you have a set amount budgeted, you just spend it on different things. The 5-year capital plan that we submitted to RIDE had a set dollar amount we would spend every year. So in one year we would spend it on middle school fields, in another year we would spend it on generators, in another year we would spend it on windows. But each year there's a set pool of money that we're trying to budget for, and the following year we spend it on a different item. In much the same way the 2% capital in Forster and the 2% capital in Gloucester there's a dollar amount every single year, you just choose to spend it differently. This bill would prohibit us from having a dollar amount every single year. And at least as currently written, it applies not just to the regional district, it applies to every school district. And I believe the argument could be made if a district cannot include a capital expense in their budget, Forster, we would not have been able to share the expense with you. We put up some money from our budget, and you put up some money from yours. The same happened in Gloucester. If all schools in the state were prohibited from budgeting, I don't know that we could have shared that expense. I'll defer to a finance director to say whether or not that's true, but unless I have money in my budget, I can't share the expense.
Yes, Mr. Setti.
Since these haven't been acted on, common that amendments are made to bills all the time. It's a sub-A that comes in on a bill. If the language is the language that needs to be changed, it's a word, or one or two words that need to be stricken. I believe we have an issue in submitting that to our legislatures to have those words changed and support, if that's what the Foster Council brings forward as wording in the resolution, that we would adopt the same thing.
We have no issue with that. No clarification. Finance director sees the issue, Mr. Bond sees that. There's absolutely no intention to prohibit.
The cap.
We didn't think that either. Kelly and I had discussion about that.
Let's get the language amended to the extent that you'd like to see it. And we're agreeing with that, as long as the concept is what we're talking about.
If I could make one other point, I want to retrace back to the comments that have been made earlier by Councilman Setti. So we had in our budget, if you remember, the building project under the previous superintendent ran over, and we did not raise our budget to identify a capital lease. Our budget stayed the same, and we made some cuts in other parts of our budget, and we came up with a capital lease of about $165,000 per year. When that capital lease was paid off, that line item in our budget went from $165,000 to zero. So that $165,000 that Councilman Setti is referencing did not stay in our budget. When that was paid off as a capital lease, the line item in our budget went from $165,000 to zero. We did add money in another part of our budget for the one-to-one technology. And you may remember several years ago, we came before the council and said we were going to one-to-one technology for our high school and our middle school. And instead of paying money on interest and on the debt for the building projects, we actually then we're investing that money in technology. So the line item for debt went down, or capital lease, and the line item for technology went up. That was presented clearly to the voters at the financial town meeting, and they did approve that. There's one last distinction that I will make to you as a regional school district. Our charter talks about operating budget, and our charter talks about debt service. So anything that's bonded debt over multiple years, like a mortgage, is done in debt service. Everything else is considered a capital expense. So for starting 2 years ago, this school committee has made a conscious effort, and we've said this at every financial town meeting. The town of Foster has a 2% capital set aside. And that 2% is 2% of the elementary school budget, plus 2% of the town's budget, plus 2% of the regional school budget. So you take all three of those buckets of money, and then you take 2% off the top, and that's what you use for capital project. The town of Gloucester does it exactly the same way. We did not have a 2% line for capital in our budget, which is part of the reason the buildings got to be in such disrepair, because they weren't maintained. So following that good practice, last year we added 1% to our budget for capital expenses. This year we added another 0.5%, which got us to 1.5%. And our plan next year, as I said at the financial town meeting, is to add an additional 0.5%. That translates to another $75,000. If the voters choose to approve our budget next year with that extra $75,000, we will have 2% in our budget, just like the town of Foster and just like the town of Gloucester. Then we'll be able to execute a 5-year plan that maintains, preserves, and enhances the facilities just like you do in the towns. So I think having the ability for a 2% set aside that has been presented to the voters and approved by the voters is appropriate. And I would say not having the ability to maintain our schools in the same way the town and the elementary schools are maintained would be a mistake.
Thank you, Dr. Bond. Mr. Sabazio.
Yeah, I try and talk plain and about politics. I heard two things tonight. I heard about the building project and the ESCO, and I heard about a vote to put the capital and the operating together. Those things have been being argued by the Gloucester Town Council since they happened. Now, Mike Chippendale is our representative. I think he represents the whole town, correct? And he only represents a little piece of Gloucester, right? Did any of you get notice of the bills that he put forth for Gloucester that you were supposed to know about? That's the first issue. My second issue is, and I'd like to give you some facts. Between the years 2006 and 2015, 2006 is when the building projects were started, the regional budget has increased $2.4 million. During the same years, 2006 to 2015, the Gloucester town budget has increased $6.4 million. We built 2 buildings for $64 million. What did they build? Of that $6.4 million, they put $4.1 million in surplus. They presently have $13 million in surplus, $4 million hidden in their schools, their grade schools, that the Attorney General, the Auditor General says they're not supposed to have.
May I stop
Excuse me, no, excuse me.
I would like to stop you. This is not a Gloucester Town Council meeting.
This,
This is our meeting, and we're discussing this resolution.
right, but it's being brought forth by the Gloucester Town Council. This took a day and a half of my superintendent's time. This constant stuff that comes before the region, all right, that you pay for, takes time and money away from our ability to operate. All right? So anything they put forward, I would suspect, has to do more with politics and their obsession with the region than anything that's good for anyone.
Thank you.
Madam Chair.
Mr. Set, I'll recognize Mr. Setti first.
First off, I'd like to say up front that I have been asking for a joint meeting between 2 town councils, Foster and Gloucester, and the regional school committee for 18 months, okay? I've been denied before the last 2 budget sessions, so we can have these kind of discussions in a forum that allows us to present all these information and correct a lot of the things that are being said that are incorrect, okay? So for 18 months, we've been denied. Now, I have sent emails to some of the members of the board here asking for that meeting. No one ever responded, okay? Dr. Barnes and I have had correspondence on this in the past as well. Every time we get a request for a meeting, it's either the school committee with the Gloucester Town Council, the school committee with the Foster Town Council. And I keep saying, why can't we all meet? Now, at one point I worked as a town administrator in Richmond, part of the Charahoe School District. And we used to meet 3 towns, 3 town councils, the school committee from the regional school district, our financial people, our legal people, and our state representatives at the beginning of the budget process every year. It's called an omnibus meeting, okay? I don't understand why the same thing can't happen here, okay? Now, there are issues. The next proposal we have in front of you is an offshoot of that. And I'll be quite honest and quite frank with you and say, and I'll give you the reasons why. It's because my concern is, as time goes on, Senate Bill 3050 is beginning to affect both our towns, okay? I've looked at your budgets the last 3 years. You've had a 4%, 3.4% increase. Now, Gloucester, we've chosen not to go to 4%, but it affects us because when it comes to the levy and what we could levy going forward, depending on increases that keep coming out, we're shrinking the ability to include town services into our budgets. It's going to happen, okay? I work in Massachusetts now, I deal with Proposition 2.5, deal with it every day. So I think I have a little bit of background, a little bit of knowledge of how this all works and what happens, okay? Again, the reason for the meetings, the reason for all of us to get together is to have these discussions, okay? Everyone surfaces your questions, raises your issues, we all put on the table, what are the needs that we have going forward, okay? You know, I'm sure there's needs that you have as a town, just like we have as a town, that sometimes have to get pushed to the back burner because of certain things. And because of whether or not our taxpayers can afford it, okay? I don't know what your exemption list is like. We have $2.4 million worth of exemptions in the town of Gloucester. Now, you might think, well, you know, what do you get with exemption for everything? That's mostly for elderly, for veterans, and people who are disabled. Okay? So it's 2.4 million in taxes that we can't collect, or we don't collect. Okay, so that burden gets shifted to the other taxpayers in the town. And I'm sure it's a similar situation you have in Forest. Now, if I might, you know, I don't know if you're ready to go into the next,
Not yet.
okay.
Thank you.
Just like a comment, we came to this meeting to talk about the two issues, you know, before you. And, you know, we appreciate it if you can stay there. And, you know, I don't want to get into political issues with the school committee or anything like that. We feel that these two things that we're presenting, since we're towns of similar nature, that they're going to affect you the same way they affect us. And we just want to share our ideas with you as to why we think they're important. And if you don't agree, that's okay. But at least we've had the opportunity to talk about it. And maybe we can shed some light on some things that we see coming down the road that look like the 800-pound gorilla in the room. I mean, between the two towns here, we have a potential serious problem in the event that one or two of the towns reject the overall budget. And, you know, we put some numbers together last year, we talked about those later on. But you've got the same situation, and the question is, how do we best deal with it? We're not saying that we got the best idea, but we want to at least float it before you so you have an opportunity to think about it. I mean, this is a long-term process. We've had a region here since the late 1950s, years and years and years, okay? Things change. We know that the incentive for the regionalization has changed. The 2% is no longer there. So now they've also changed some other rules. So how can we be current with our thinking and keep ourselves out of trouble and not get into the soup like Central Falls, Woonsocket, East Providence, is headed? So we don't want to go there. So that's why we want to have this discussion. I want to have a constructive discussion and not have the political.
Well, I'd like to add, I think, again, I think we all can agree that this isn't a bad resolution. I think we were close to discussing maybe a language change, and I think John, I was talking to John real quick, he thinks there's two ways that we might be able to change that, because this is his kind of expertise, mine's in construction. Maybe he can help us out.
Well, sure, so just to sort of parse out the two things that this resolution is trying to do, one relates to non-recurring debt service and non-recurring capital expenses in the annual budget, and the other relates to non-recurring debt service and capital expenses in the maintenance of efforts. So I guess partly, I noted in this bill, with respect to debt service, it says that it's no longer carried on the books of any school district. That should not be included in the school district's annual budget. That's in the language for the existing. So I guess part of what I'm trying to understand is what the significance is of changing this to make it so that the non-recurring debt service and non-recurring capital expenses are not in the annual budget. What does that accomplish? Is it just relating to the stuff that's no longer carried on the books? Okay, so maybe that's the solution, to include language for the non-recurring debt service. I don't know if carried on the books is particular to debt service as opposed to capital expenses, but if there's something analogous, like not relating to any expense in that current fiscal year.
I believe they're referring to any capital, like long-term capital. Long-term in this situation isn't, I believe, anything over 1 year. So if they can't budget, the question is,
I think
maintenance
that's
of
what it
effort
does,
versus.
but I don't think that's
That's
the
what Gary
intention.
said.
Right, so I don't know how to necessarily, I don't understand why there would be a problem with budgeting capital. And why those two issues can't be separated. Budgeting for it, but yet having it not included in, can't you have a capital fund capital project fund budget that's
Yeah,
not included in your operations, and
Right.
that would solve your problem,
Right,
I
and
think.
that's, I think that's the issue. It's not, it's when the debt is satisfied. The debt that's satisfied shouldn't continue to be carried forward unless there's other capital that comes into play. This has to do more than, I think, though, and I'll defer to Buster here, of any expense that might be, a capital expense that might be carried operational. So if it's, you know, and obviously that clearly defines the debt, you know, how we've traditionally paid for debt in the past.
See, the region doesn't vote on these things separately. They vote on one lump sum budget. They don't separate the capital budget. So you're not voting on that separate every year. So if they're spending $500,000 on a football field this year and track next year and bleachers the following year, but, you know, hundreds of thousands of dollars on these capital improvement projects, that should be no different than, you know, if it's a one-time thing, it shouldn't be built into the maintenance of effort, but the way that's being done right now, it increases that maintenance of effort. And I think this resolution is to separate it so that it doesn't increase that maintenance of effort. And once it's paid, whether it's a one-time, 1 year, 2 years, whatever, once it's paid, it's not included anymore in the annual budget of that. I think that's maybe what you were reading, John. I have it in front of me.
Maybe another example would be that when we put our budget together in town, we have the regional portion that comes in, then we have the Gloucester schools and the municipal, and then we have a separate one that's called the capital budget. And that is a separate group of expenditures that changes from year to year, not unlike what Dr. Barnes was talking about, if he was going to have his 2% set aside. But those are not part of the, well, the 2% is part of the appropriation, the amount raised by taxes, but that segment is separated, so people can clearly see, you know, what it is that's capital. And those are truly defined as capital according to the financial guidelines. You know, a building repair, a vehicle that would be depreciated. So it's a separate list. And conceptually, if we put together a regional basis as a capital list program, it would also include pieces of a 5-year program. You know, we've done that before, where, you know, we'll say, well, all right, we've got a 5-year program. Here's 1/5 of the total cost, and it's in the capital for this year. And the other 1/5 would show up next year. But at least it's defined, and it's separate. Okay, it's not part of maintenance of effort.
So it sounds like what you're trying to say is, at the regional level, you'd like the towns to have the authority to approve capital expenses separate from their operating.
I'm not sure. No, I wouldn't necessarily say that. I think that, you know, we've all agreed that debt service should not be part of maintenance of effort. Okay, that's law now. But at least we know as part of the total program, you know, whether have the capital items defined. And, you know, I don't know now if the way Dr. Barnes has described it, if the 2% set aside is going to become part of maintenance of effort. It may or may not. But I'm not sure. But we just wanted to make sure that those specific items would not go on to be part of the maintenance of effort.
Because I did also see that part of the existing law says that a community which experiences a non-recurring expenditure for its schools may deduct the non-recurring expenditure computing its maintenance of effort. Goes on to say that it's with the approval of the commissioner, but that there is already an opportunity to deduct non-recurring expenses from maintenance of effort. So maybe part of simplifying this in order to give greater flexibility to the town would be removing the requirement that the commissioner have approval of that.
Again, you got some suggestions to the language, or guess to where we want to go. We're open to that.
Yeah.
Again, we're here to, you know, put it before you and say, what issues are there?
And I'm just trying to understand exactly what we're trying to accomplish.
Just as a small example, I sat in on a meeting at the region and they were talking about buying a new $55,000 or $60,000 pickup truck. I don't think the town of Forster would buy a pickup truck just out of their operating expense. You know, that's a capital expenditure, you depreciate it, it's on the books, and when you get rid of it and junk it, it's all documented, the whole life of it, but the region buys that kind of stuff out of their operating budget, which increases your maintenance of effort, year to year. They're gonna buy that $60,000 pickup truck this year, that money's still in there next year with nowhere for it to go. It's coming out of your pocket, my pocket, and now they just pick something else to spend it on. So I think that was one of the reasons, just as an example, for that resolution.
And I think I'm still, you know, well, I think everyone agrees that it doesn't make sense for those expenses to be included in the maintenance of effort. I'm not sure what the language concerning what is and is not included in the budget, how that impacts the maintenance of effort question.
I'd like to, let me give you a concrete example. Opposite of their concrete example. This year, I think it was last year, the regional school committee voted to start lacrosse. I played lacrosse, I coached college lacrosse, I know about lacrosse, and I singularly told them not to do it because of the draw on the facilities. So Dr. Barnes now has to come up with an idea of how he's gonna get these fields, right? Going back to the old way the budget was handled, where Mr. Burlingame says it was changed. We voted on two ways, operating and capital, right? What happened was the operating budget passed and all the people left. The people who were against a field, buying a truck, I don't care what it was, stayed and voted down. This happened one year, I was not on the school committee, and voted down the capital budget. And what happened was, it came out of the kids. So that's why the ruling was given by the solicitor and through numbers of discussions why we vote on one thing. Now, should we buy a truck and should it be capitalized? But overall, you cannot separate our votes for capital and operating because you can always get 50 people from Gloucester to be upset about a $65,000 truck, and they'll vote down the budget, and we won't buy computers.
Well, that's wrong right there. You shouldn't buy the truck. You still buy your computers.
Well, excuse me, I'm addressing the chair.
That's the problem with the region.
Thank you. Dr. Bonds.
One of the hardest and most difficult things, is part of the reason everyone spends so much time on it, is understanding the nuances of budgeting and finances. So I'm going to try and make it about as concrete as I can. There are three different buckets. Two of the buckets we're not in disagreement on. One bucket is debt service. You pay a mortgage on a building, you buy a truck for 10 years, you pay a lease on it. When that expense is finished being paid, that can be removed from maintenance of effort by the current law. That's already in law, that debt service can be removed. Everyone sitting at this table agrees that can be done and should be done. The second piece is the operating budget. And that's where you buy papers and supplies and other items. What Councilman Steele was referencing is the third bucket, which is capital. So on the town side, for example, in Gloucester, they put forward a budget that says, this is what we're going to spend for operating, this is what we're going to spend for debt service, and the voters approved that. Their charter says, once that budget is set, 2% of the total spending will also be set aside for capital. So they take the budget that was passed and an additional 2% is added for capital. So they have three buckets, one of which is generated by charter. So every single year there's a recurring amount of 2%, that's not 2.1, not 1.9, it's 2% by charter. So they have those three buckets. On our budget several years ago, we started representing our budget with exactly those same three buckets. One bucket is all the operating, the second bucket is the debt service, and the third bucket is the capital. And so we show how much dollar amount we're spending on capital. In this fiscal year, we asked 1.5% from the local voters. What we're trying to do is get to the same 2% level, which is only $75,000 more. So basically, 1.5% is already in our maintenance of effort. We're really having a discussion about $75,000, which is what we're trying to add for next year into maintenance of effort. And then we'd be at the same 2% of the towns. We want to be able to do that, so, much as Steve said, in each year, you set aside a 5-year plan. Remember working with Ms. King and with Ms. Russ, we set aside a 5-year plan for the elementary school. This is what we're looking to do year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4, year 5. We're able to do that plan because we basically had a revenue stream that we were predicting. That's exactly how the town is able to set up your 5-year plan. You know you have 2% per year by your charter. That's all we're trying to get to with the region is exactly the same place. We do separate out the we do separate out the capital, the debt service. It's done with one vote. The voters don't get to say yes or no to the amount of the capital, but they also don't get to say yes or no to the amount of the capital on the town side. The charter in Gloucester says it's 2%. The voters don't get to say it's 1.5 or 2.5. The charter specifically says it's 2%. So it's very similar to exactly what's already occurring on the town side. The very last thing I will say is that we also look whenever we can to make cuts. And we are moving forward with the school committee to re-amortize our loans. So as information to the committee, we are going out and bundling our loans with several other communities. It will not change the length of time left on our debt, about 12 years. It will not have extra costs for next year. What that will result in is the local town saving about $1.5 million in the mortgage payments. So our mortgage payment for the rest of the loan will be saving about $1.5 million. And we expect that to show up in our next year's budget because we're going through the banking process now. And that resulted in about $130,000 to $150,000, matches different years, savings per year. So next year we will be bringing a budget that will remove about $130,000 to $150,000, depending on how the bonds get sold from our budget. We'll be seeking to add $75,000 for capital. That should be a net reduction for the community, at least on adding debt service and capital. So we're really having a discussion over adding an additional $75,000 to our budget, and our debt service will be removed reduced by at least $130,000 next year.
Thank you. Mrs. Ryder.
This may be a silly question, but why has the region not put a capital provision in their charter so they have a third bucket, but it's a defined third bucket that cannot go up 0.5% every year? I don't know.
Can I respond to that? Our regional charter does require the vote, the 2 town councils to put something on the ballot, requires the voters to vote on it, or it requires the legislature to move forward with an actual legislation. We do not have the ability to change our own charter. There are 2 distinct ways to do it. Maybe what might be fair, because I already heard Councilman Steady make the statement that they are not looking to impact what those 5-year plans are on the housing aid reimbursement. That was not the intent of the town council to say schools shouldn't be spending money, and the intent wasn't to prevent that from happening so we'd lose housing aid reimbursement. I think that's pretty clear from everyone sitting at the table. So I believe in coherence. So maybe as you're looking to make a change to the language, Mr. Estivo, the language becomes a district may not maintain more than 2% in a non-recurring capital account as far as maintenance of effort. That would put us exactly in the exact same place that the town is for Forster, and put us in exactly the same place the town is for Gloucester. Would make it clear that us and the rest of the state could not have more than 2% maintained in their budget or in the maintenance of effort for non-recurring capital expenses. Maybe that's a solution to the problem because it puts us in exactly the same place the 2 town charters currently are.
Thank you. After hearing all this discussion, I'm wondering if there's a need for an amendment to the initial motion.
I think there may be, I'm not sure that you know exactly how to word it.
Right, that's what I'm... would we want to consider so that we're not doing this by the seat of our pants? If we table this to the next meeting, our next town council meeting, to get the wording appropriate.
I think that's wise. I'm not sure that to the extent the General Assembly is actively considering this, I'm not sure that that's, that they're going to be decided necessarily.
I think, yeah, we're at the point of initial discussions on this thing, and given the fact that the legislature's coming close, okay, I don't necessarily have an expectation that having heard this tonight, that you folks are going to make a decision and do it in time. What we're trying to do is to get the process started here. So we can come up with something that is workable and acceptable to all of us.
And that's where I think we can have meetings that have been suggested, that the school committee and the town of Gloucester and the town of Forster meet, post it, and do this.
That's what we've been wanting. And I think, I'll just say that
maybe this brought it to a head,
the next
obviously has to happen.
The next item has the same context, first thing through. But we want to get something that we can come together on, come to some agreement, so that at least we've got a plan going forward, everyone can agree to, so we don't go to the financial town meeting to go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, on this particular item.
Mr. Lewis, did you have your, I wasn't sure whether you had your hand up or if you were moving.
Well, I was going to ask a question related to what Mr. Restivo said. If we don't take some sort of action tonight, is the legislature just going to pass it as is? It seems like we should put forward something saying we agree with the concept but not the wording, and therefore we would like the time to consider it.
Well, Gloucester, I think Gloucester's looking at, finally making some decisions that we might meet. You guys might want to think about pulling the bills and having the discussion moving forward, so.
The feedback we got is they're not going to do anything without your consent.
Right, that's the feedback I had received.
They're not going to, neither of it. It won't happen unless you, Forest Council, and us have a common resolution.
And I think they're fully willing to tweak anything that we jointly, want to have
Yeah,
changed.
but we got to go in with a handshake for them to do anything.
Well, I'm glad that we set this up, but I do think it's right to get it right rather than get it done quickly. So hopefully this is the start of more dialogue.
I'm okay with that.
Absolutely. I'm just pulling up an email that I received from Mr. Chippendale in regards to that, and it does say that they did not vote on it because there was no supporting resolutions from Forster or the Connegantic District. So they felt that there wasn't enough of a backing to hear it. So he was waiting for us to come up with something. I agree, I don't think it's going to be heard at this time.
If we table it at this time to a future meeting, next meeting, whatever.
Yes.
We would correspond with Mr. Chippendale, Mr. Kettle, Mr. Fogarty, and we're confident they would hold.
I do have an email saying that.
You don't have an email.
Well,
One person, yeah.
I don't have an email. I'm not.
I feel comfortable saying to Mr. Chippendale, if he does bring it forward, wait a minute, you sent me this email, and I do save my email, just so you want to know.
Especially, why don't you put together language like you see and send it back to us?
Right, that's what we're discussing here, that we would like to table it to the next so that the wording can get correct, that our finance person is fine with it, and we sit down again and say, okay, this is our wording, and give it to you. Is that what I'm hearing, Mr. Restivo? Mr. Lewis, what are you thinking?
I was just gonna ask if someone on the Gloucester Council would contact the representatives as well and ask them to do the same thing. Hold it until we can hammer out between us.
We'll do that.
So that we're sure that it doesn't jump track.
And will you be doing that, Mr. Lewis?
Contacting,
Mr. Chippendale and Mr. Kettle?
I can do that.
Well, you're requesting them, I was wondering who's gonna do it from our council.
We can do it from our side because we requested it in the first place.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, we can decide on our side who's gonna do it. I'll be happy to do it, the town clerk can do it, you can respond, you know, as long as we have record and they, but I thought if both towns asked, there would be
Yes.
more weight.
Yes,
Since Gloucester asked for it to go forward initially, if they asked for it to be held, that might have more weight than us asking without.
I'm sure if the town clerk does it, she can CC over to our clerk, so we have it.
so I'm going to go back to, do we want to
Yeah,
move our motions and table this?
I will go in a second.
I got just a question. We're not gonna have our council meeting next week, so if you got your council meeting now, and if you make a decision, if you wanna send a note to the reps now, because your meeting, that would
Okay,
get that.
so
that would
expedite,
take care of
yes.
it, rather than have to wait for
So
us
if
to
we
mention it.
send it,
But if you do it, if you say, look, could you please hold it, that'll stop it.
that makes sense, thank you.
Okay.
Okay, so we,
The motion's on the table. Can you make, can anyone make a motion to table and to authorize communication in the same?
sure.
All right. But I'll move to table this to a future council meeting and authorize council president to communicate with our representatives, notifying them that we've moved to table this and requesting that it not be approved in its current form until we treat the language.
Second.
Discussion. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, thank you. Mr. Lewis, I now hand it over to you.
Okay, so we have a second resolution from, initiated by the Gloucester Town Council, and this was for the creation of a regional tax district. So they approved the resolution, and we crafted a Town of Foster resolution that essentially reflects their wording, almost exactly their wording. So I'll read this and then we can consider this. Resolution of the Foster Town Council, subject proposing the creation of the Foster Gloucester Regional School Tax District. Whereas the Foster Gloucester Regional School District was established in 1958 with the intention of providing secondary education to 6th through 12th grade students in the towns of Foster and Gloucester. And whereas the financial support of the regional school district was to be the responsibility of the two member towns in a manner that was affordable to its residents. And whereas in 2006, the Senate passed Senate Bill number 3050, which limits the amount the town can apply a levy of tax over its prior year assessment to no more than an increase of 4% per annum. This levy is to cover both municipal and school budget operational and capital expenses in a given fiscal year. And whereas this law puts an ever-increasing burden on towns to stay within their levy limit. And whereas the Foster Gloucester Regional School District has decided that although they are a pass-through for funds from the two member towns, that the needs of the regional school district supersede the ability for the member towns to continue to provide necessary services such as public safety, public works, and general town administration. Now therefore be it resolved that the Foster Town Council, through its elected representative and senator in the Rhode Island General Assembly, hereby requests that legislation be drafted and considered by the entire body of both the House and Senate, that the Foster Gloucester Regional School District become its own taxing district, not unlike similar districts in other states across the United States, for the purpose of raising, appropriating, and collecting taxes of their own for operating and capital expenses, subject to the laws of the state of Rhode Island, and that the towns of Foster and Gloucester will no longer have an appropriation made through their municipal taxes for the purpose of funding the regional school district. That's the wording of the resolution that came to us from Gloucester. We just changed the name of the town. What's the pleasure of the council? Is there a motion to get it on the table for discussion?
I'll make a motion that we accept this resolution presented.
Is there a second?
Second.
Okay, so. Since this was, I'm gonna let the gentleman from the Gloucester Town Council speak first, since you sent it to us, and let it give us some background and your justification, and then I'll recognize people from the school committee to address their.
I'll just give you, I'll give you an overview of what prompted this. We, back a couple of years ago, had a resolution on the ballot to have a townwide referendum in place of the town meeting. It was controversial because at the time we felt that, at least at the time, we had the town meeting and the budget was discussed, the people that were attending and the people that were more importantly voting at least understood and heard the logic for the budget. They understood all the details and this, that, and the other thing. So, you know, the first time through this year, we went through it and we had a public hearing on the budget. 5 people showed up. But when it came down to it, we had over 220 people vote on the budget. And we had 3 questions on it. One had to do with the overall budget, where it was passed by like, I don't know, 119 or 123 to 99 against. We had another one on a land purchase, which had more in favor. And then we had the question on the schools with the 5-year capital improvement program, that where there was 66 people that voted against it, as opposed to the 99 that voted against the overall budget. The dilemma here was that because we had embedded in the original budget the $300,000 for the current contribution for the Gloucester schools for this next coming year, and had that been defeated, it would have killed the third question, where we wouldn't have been able to go forward with our capital improvement program for the $600,000 a year, 300 from Gloucester and 300 from the Gloucester surplus and 300 from the school surplus. So there was a dilemma. The other thing that popped out was that our budget had about a $400,000 increase in the appropriation amount raised by taxes. $330,000 of that was from the region, which the voters had already passed, and we have to write the check for that. And we had a problem many years ago where, you know, the voters at the town meeting took exception to the regional vote, and at the Gloucester town meeting, they said, we're not going to pay the regional bill. It's too much, it's excessive. So we wound up not paying it for a year or 2. But at the end of the day, the court said, no, you owe the money, you're going to pay the bill. So it was about $200,000 a year, so when finally came due, we had a $400,000 bill that we hadn't paid for 2 years. So the law has already been established that, you know, at this point, you know, once the financial town meeting takes place for the region, that's it. In other words, Gloucester owes it, and Gloucester owes it. On the other hand, if in fact the main motion had been defeated in Gloucester, we would have still had to pay the $330,000. We still would have to pay the amount to the Gloucester schools because we couldn't reduce that because of the maintenance of effort. So the $330,000 had to be absorbed from the non-school and the non-region for all the other municipal things. And that's a small percentage of the total budget. So it's a dilemma. And we think somewhere, sometime down the road, it's going to happen in Foster, or it's going to happen in Gloucester, where people are going to get together, and for whatever reason, they come out, and they consider the main motion on the overall budget. Be it for Foster or Gloucester, if you got an increase in that, from the region, you're going to have to absorb that in the municipal budget, because you're not going to be able to reduce it in the schools. The other thing is, that I don't know if you have labor contracts with your, municipal employees, but, they also say you've got so many hours that they have to work. So you couldn't reduce hours to save money. You would have to shut down programs, or you would have to, lay off people. But for us, for example, if we were going to find $330,000 in our municipal budget, it would be a disaster. So the thinking was that how could we avoid this? And a lot of other municipalities throughout the country have had their school districts, their regional school districts, like tax districts. And in effect, when you look at Foster and Gloucester, we are a tax district, because there's a financial town meeting where the people come and vote from each side, each town, and they vote an appropriation, they vote the tax. The only difference is that they don't collect it. So one thought would be that to avoid a real potential problem going forward is we have the regional school district collect the taxes. Now, there's a lot of people who would say, well, that's going to be a nightmare. Well, it's not really, because, you know, in our town, we have 3 separate fire districts, and each of them handle it a different way. One of them, Patchett Fire District, gets a run from a tax assessor that has all of the exemptions and all the stuff included. And then that is the basis for which the fire district tax bills go up. Accordingly, someone could ask the question, well, what do they do with exemptions and all of that? You know, and those exemptions would be set up so that the taxpayers with their exemptions be kept whole. Yeah, it might be a little bit difficult, not difficult, but there'd have to be some prorations in how the tax exemption is prorated between the region and the town. But that's not impossible with the computers today. So the whole idea was to extricate ourselves from that liability early on, before the voters in our town have their say on the overall budget. But it's not really the overall budget. It's the Gloucester schools and it's the municipal budget. So we're looking for a solution here. And this was one that we just wanted to bring before you know, for consideration. Not going to solve it tonight. The legislation that's on the table is enabling legislation. That's all it is. It's like when we went back many moons ago when the region was formed. The first thing that happened, there was enabling legislation. It said, shall the towns of Boston and Gloucester be enabled to create a school district? And that was it. And then they said, okay, once that was done, then the towns of Boston and Gloucester got together with their school committees, and they came up they fleshed out the rules and procedures and created the legislation that got the region to where it is. And, you know, they tweak it from time to time. Again, the legislation that's down there now is just enabling. It doesn't get into the weeds as to how you do it. That is something that the towns of Foster and Gloucester and the school committees would work out. And, you know, if we can't work it out, so be it. But at least it starts a process. There's a concept that a lot of other communities throughout the country have used very successfully, and it works. So, again, we're before you tonight to just consider the enabling portion of it. Not to get into the details, but just say, do you want to have the enabling so that we can at least start to work on this and decide, you know, how we might get there? If you don't, okay, but I just want to make sure that you understood, it's enabling only. There's nothing decided. Okay, so that was my case.
Yeah, I have a packet, I'll meet with, you know, the chair, if it's okay. As Councilor Brugge, you pointed out, other states in the country have school taxing districts. Very common in the state of New York, Pennsylvania, many other communities. I have here one that actually spells out the school taxes and the assessment process, because I know that may be a concern, is how will the assessment take place. It's done a number of different ways, right down to the town providing the role from the assessor's office to the schools. And what Councilor Burlingame said, an appropriation made as a result of that. There's also, on this one, is a note about property tax exemptions. It talks about the various exemptions that already people may get, you know, in their community on their municipal taxes. They're also carried forward on the school tax as well. You know, the issues around rate structure and how that works. Again, it's enabling legislation. All those things can be worked out as to what's going to be agreeable between everyone going forward. But the other issue is that going back to Senate Bill 3050, is a 4% levy. Okay, this will allow the regional school district to assess at 4%, and, you know, they can assess whatever they want at that point. But it also allows us on what we have on our budgets, the municipality, to do what we need to do to continue to manage our towns in an effective manner. As I said earlier, we're getting to a point where if there's consistently 4% increases or, or around that area, where it's gonna be a very small window for the municipalities to really do anything that they may need to do going forward. So if I might.
Actually, if you could give it to
Town
Tom
clerk.
Clerk, she can copy it and, distribute it to,
John, I have one comment.
okay. Are you all set from the Boston Council? Okay, I'll hear Renee and then I'll hear someone from the
As
school.
far as my take on the wording of this resolution that they're asking us to pass here, enabling legislation says may. City or town may, particular city or town may create something. This says creates. This legislation, this resolution asks it to create as a conclusion. Now, does it have to come before the electorate to be ratified? Yes, but I'd say this is much more, this resolution language that I'm looking at right here is much stronger than enabling legislation that says might or may. A town may exempt, a town, even the statewide planning says may, or even a particular city or town may allow or may do something. This is a step beyond enabling. This is, create a taxing district. And now, it may have to be ratified by a vote, but you're a step closer than is being represented.
I think the law, if you look at the legislation, I think it said May.
That's not what this
The rest of the resolution.
Well, I have the state law,
Oh, what is it?
Senate Bill
Did it say May?
S2681, and it says effective July 1st, 2016, the Foster Gloucester Regional School District, hereinafter referred to as Regional School District, shall have the authority to levy taxes to support both core and non-core educational activities and expenses.
All right.
So, so that, I don't think that's enabling, it grants them the authority with this bill. Someone from the school department who would like to, Mr. Savasio?
Yeah, thank you, Jeff. There's all kinds of problems with this. First of all, the school committee or the region either has to build a whole taxing structure or it has to pay the towns to do the work. So in either case, one costs more than the other, but this is a pass back. We're going to tax people and then pass it back to the towns. Still don't know something that the solicitor brought up. Do we have to pay for police and fire? The other problem is 4% at the region, 4% at the region, and 4% in the towns actually raises people's taxes. So I don't know how this solves the problem. Mr. Setti deals in Hopedale. Massachusetts works at 2.5%, probably 2.5%. We work at 4%. 4% was passed to cut expenses, to make the towns deal with their costs, all right, and find a better way of cost. What this enabling legislation does says, the hell with it, everybody charge 4%. I know everybody's going to say it doesn't say that, but this is one of those things, not having a superintendent who's willing to do zero tax increases and comes forward every year asking for 4% and packs that meeting, you're actually going to take the cost of taxpayers more. These two towns, Foster and Gloucester, it's brought up numerous times by Mr. Setti, we have problems. We have problems for something I've been talking about for 30 years. The elderly and disabled tax freeze that Gloucester passed recently in the last 10 years. And our inability to want businesses and bring businesses to our community to offset taxes. So from my way of thinking, I would rather see us struggle and be forced into dealing with the reality of the world we live in and bring businesses in and operate like real towns. So this resolution is the worst possible thing you guys can do to the taxpayers, even a neighborhood.
I apologize.
Do I add something?
Yes.
At some point, I agree, but I also disagree with Ron's, and excuse me, I'll give you an example. Now, the state says that the town as a whole cannot go up 4%. Now, let's say that's $100, just to make numbers easy. If this was enacted, we'd actually be saving money the last 3 years because of the fiscal budgeting of the region. They've come forward with a 1 or 2% increase. Okay, now, the state says, as a whole, we cannot go up 4%. Then it comes to the Forster Town Council, and we say, hey, we can't go up as a 4, they've only took 2% of the apple. So we've gone up some years 10% on our municipal, in our paint school, because the money's been left on the table from the region. So this council has taken the advantage to use all that money up on their side. So if this was set in stone where it's 4% for them, and it's 4% for us, the last 3 years, we would have been levying a lesser tax rate on the taxpayers if they came forward with 2% of their 4%. That would have been true savings. And we would have only gone up, if we went up to 4%, would have been just the 4% of our municipal and paint school. So there's two sides of the argument. So at this point, the last 3 years, whatever money, I don't want to use the word that was spent on this side, that was left on the table, would have been cheaper if they were doing the tax bill and administrating on their end. So there's both sides of the argument that this could actually save money in some years, and I'm using the past 3 years, and it's because of the fiscal responsibility that the region has done. By Ron stating, giving you 0 increases for 3 years, he drives that into our head. We used, and they said it right here, lots of council committees, we went up 4%, 4%, and 3.5%. Well, we spent over 4% on our town side, and we would not have been able to if they were locked into 4, and we were locked into 4. So we would have been saving the taxpayers. We'd have been forced not to spend the money. So many times this would actually save the taxpayers money.
Is that Ann?
Yeah, that.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, Ben.
I just have a question. So if the region is collecting taxes, okay, and we get into that whole business, what happens if a family can't pay those taxes? Their kids are in our school, we have psychologists, and we have nurses, and we have social workers to deal with all the issues kids are dealing with today. We have a drug counselor. Now we have to say, and by the way, you're homeless because we gotta take you home because you didn't pay your taxes. I mean, that is just not something that we should be getting into. Our job is to educate, take care of kids, not kick them out of their homes.
I'm glad you brought that up. This is one of my great reservations is about if the region is a taxing authority, it would have the authority to put homes up for tax sale. And like it or not, the region is dominated by people who are elected from Boston, 6-3. So if the town of Foster were to approve this, we are essentially allowing the the school committee from Gloucester to put homes in Foster up for tax sale. And I have a stretch. Because if we didn't like, if the residents in the town of Foster didn't like how that was being handled, they don't even have recourse to go to us.
It would be their tax.
What is it?
It wouldn't be the school committee, it should be their tax official, whoever that would be. Just like you don't get involved in our tax sale.
But they are responsible and work for the school committee, which is dominated by Boston.
Yes, but I would assume, I believe that you can't tell our tax collector not to put a particular home up for, like
No,
that
for
tax.
instance,
No,
for like a building code lien or something, our building code official has the authority to forgive the lien or to accept a lesser
Right.
amount. I think that would, even though the formal tax sale process happens on a town-by-town basis, the discretion over whether to forgive a lien or something like that, I think would be entirely within the taxing authority.
I'm gonna recognize council first.
I just think what you said is true as far as the last few years, but what happens when they need more? What happens then? Then we're facing, what are we gonna cut back our services and everything so we can accommodate their increase? I don't think that would work.
You just made my point, what I was trying to say in the beginning. There's nothing stopping the region from going up 10%.
That's right.
Right now, currently. So you're making my point. So what I'm trying to say is next year, it's 4% total from the state. They set their budget and present it first. So they get the first bite of the apple. So right now, next year, they can go for 10% of their increase and leave us peanuts left on our percent, and there's nothing stopping that now. This legislation would actually stop that.
We have a right to go and vote it down.
But if people go and approve that,
Well,
if people go and approve that and they go for 8%, I'm not saying they're going up, you're making my point on the other side. They could come in and take 2/3 of that apple and leave us nothing to run our town, and there's nothing we can do because it goes automatically. And we say at every financial town meeting, when we come to the region, there's nothing we can do about this, it was voted on in March. So next year, they can go for 8%, there's nothing we can do.
but we would know
So
that
this,
ahead of time when we bring our people.
Okay, voices.
so what I'm trying to say is you just made my point on the other side.
Gordon, we can't go more than 4%.
Yes, you can.
No.
The state says we can't go up 4% as a total.
They can't go.
No, I don't agree with you, I think they can.
The regional school district is limited to 4%.
Of their
That
budget.
was before. That was the law they just read.
Currently limited to 4%.
Correct, right.
Mrs. Rogers?
My concern is just that when people have trouble financially, now they're going to be able to choose. I'm going to pay for my house before I'm going to pay for the school, and eventually they're going to have to pay it. But year to year, if somebody who doesn't have kids says, you know what, I'm not paying my taxes for the school this year, that is going to mess with the region's budget. That's where my concern is, because people are now going to be able to pick and choose. And I think they'll choose their homes before they choose to pay the school.
That will all go back to it'll go back to the local tax collector to make that decision. The way it's, we're getting into the weeds here, but the school committee or the district is not putting up the tax sale, the way the other communities have done it. It goes back, it goes back to the respective towns to make those decisions.
Who puts it up for tax sale when your fire district does, when they don't pay the fire district taxes?
Fire district.
The fire district does, so the school
But
district would come to the
that's a different structure. It's really a different structure.
I'm gonna recognize that.
I wasn't concerned about the tax sale part, I was concerned about the budgetary.
I think one of the bigger problems is, if this was Foster School we were referring to, I completely agree with what he's saying. Because Foster School is Foster Town, so even if they levy their own tax, we would still have that ultimate authority. Foster Gloucester Regional School is its own entity. It is separate from us in every way. They are completely separate. I don't believe, unless it was part of the legislation, that if they didn't want to carry over our exemptions, that they had to. Because they are separate. The difference between if we gave this and this legislation was about Foster, then it would be a natural transition. But because it's Foster Gloucester Regional and they're separate, I believe in the document itself, in the law, you would have to say that they would have to honor all of our exemptions, because it's not obligatory for them, I don't believe so, to do so, because they are completely separate. And the tax sale, I believe, the beginning, I'm referring to the bill that was presented, basically said that they would have a tax administrator, and they would be able to put, they're the ones levying it, they would be the ones who would go up for a tax sale. And I think what people are forgetting here is they need a certain amount of money. So when you go to a financial town meeting, you're approving the budgeted expenditures. So they are now going to have a budgeted revenue, Right now, they budget exactly what they ask us for, but in our budgets, when we budget for the levy, we include an uncollectible amount. Because you have to assume that not everybody's going to pay. That is subjective. It's based on history, it's based on, it's based on need, it's based on collection rate, it's based on a lot of things. And you have to actually submit that to the state, and they do ask for that. But if it's reasonable, they allow it. So the first few years that they do this, they have no basis for their uncollectible accounts. So they're gonna ask for a certain amount of money, and you're gonna vote on their expenditures, and they're gonna say, this is the levy that we need to support that, because we have an uncollectible rate of this. They're not going to risk that they're not gonna collect every dollar of what they need. So chances are their uncollectible rate is going to be somewhat conservative. Therefore, they're going to collect more than what we would have actually given them. That will add to their surplus. The following year, they might increase that. You would hope that responsibly, they would increase their budget to equal what they collected the previous year. But now they've built in a surplus. They could raise their expenditures, and the change would be nothing to the taxpayer, and that they've just backdoored it. So I understand what you're trying to do, but by adding this revenue component, you've added a different component as well. And that is subjective, and it's completely under their purview to do what they feel they need to do. And initially, even if not long-term, they would have to be conservative with this. Because right now, they've budgeted every dollar of that. They won't risk that they're gonna collect 96% versus 97%. They could use the same uncollectible rate that we use, but chances are, because it's a new bill, and I could pretty much guess, you live here, you would know better, that if we say we would collect 97%, they might say that they're gonna collect 95% because not everybody's gonna pay that school bill. There's a group of people who say, well, I don't have children in the school system, they're gonna be more conservative. Chances are they're gonna have a surplus just from the simple collections of taxes. So yes, it's gonna cost money. Yes, their levy might be higher than they would have asked for should they have just gone through with the procedure now, because they have to levy a greater amount to collect what they want. And then you haven't even gotten into the cost of the system itself. I mean, in theory, I agree that there's some accountability that comes with what they're trying to do. I totally agree with that. And you all know how I feel, because I've said this numerous times, you get a different perspective when you collect taxes. When you're creating a budget and you collect taxes, you get a whole different perspective on what you're doing. And I totally agree with that. When I first came here, I didn't collect taxes because it's a segregation of duties issue, but we're small and it happens. And you really do get a different perspective. So I agree with that. It's accountability. That said, it's definitely gonna cost you money. I don't see any way around that. And there are loopholes to everything you're trying to say. You're trying to make everybody accountable, but if you can just see, I very easily manipulated financials and budgeting to create a situation that is exactly what you're trying to avoid. And that's one thing I wanted to point out. If I'm wrong, I mean, feel free.
The other question I have, and maybe the solicitor can answer this, when I read this sentence, the regional school district shall have the authority to levy taxes. Is that just unrealistic? It seems to me, shall have the authority to levy taxes. Could they tax on motor vehicles?
It says on all categories if you read further.
Yeah,
Could they tax tangible tax on our businesses?
It is.
the whole thing from their perspective is they just get to collect taxes.
It's like they're
From
on
wherever.
everything.
Sure.
On whatever
Anything
they
that can
choose.
be taxed.
Yeah.
Sure. The tax collector, which my problem with that, and you've heard that, it's not the collector, it should be the assessor, and this is the bill itself. The tax
Are we
collector,
discussing the bill or the resolution?
well, this is what they're asking
Well,
for.
I
This is-
think the resolution supports the bill, so in order to decide whether or not we're going to support the resolution, we have to understand the bill. So
But there may be a difference in language, so I just.
I don't think I have a copy of
It basically just said that, the fair valuation of each property of each class for each town. So each class of property would be motor vehicles, it would be tangible, it would be commercial, it would be all classes.
Can I just, excuse me, Mr. Lewis?
Yes, yes.
At this point, I agree with, what I've been hearing. The bill is poorly written, and that's the fault of who wrote the bill down in its fact. He did not understand what the intent of this was. So respectfully, I would ask that you pull this and not consider this at this point.
I actually personally want to go on record against it.
Fine.
Because the first resolution that you brought, I think, has merit. The second resolution of making them a tax district, I'm jaded to a certain extent because I served 4 years on the school committee. And there were 6 members from Gloucester and 3 members from Boston. And they may all be the nicest people, but I ran into a budget year where the budget passed 6-3. Everyone from Gloucester voted for it, everyone from Foster voted against it. The entire representation of this town voted against the regional budget. But yet it went forward. The superintendent wanted it to go forward, and all the principals and administrators wanted it to go forward, and 6 members of the Gloucester School Committee wanted it to go forward, so it went forward. And we were left there for them again. And it passed at the financial town meeting over our objections. And I just find getting further down that, increasing that relationship further when we really don't have an equal relationship on the school committee. We really don't have an equal relationship at the regional school. We can convince, but we can't compel. We can tie anything up if we didn't want to say forward. And because of that, I couldn't possibly yield more power to the region. And I'm not saying anything negative about anybody who's currently on the region. Speaking about my personal experience in the past, it was unsettling. And because of that, I couldn't allow them to put foster houses up for tax sale. I just don't think we would always get a favorite.
One more comment, now that he's handed me this bill, I know he's saying about removing it, but another important thing, again, as I'm reading this quickly, the authority to levy taxes, again, no enablement, the authority to levy taxes, both core and non-core educational activities and expenses. I'm not an educator, but non-core to me means if they decide every kid needs an iPad, then that's part of the expenses. So it's really putting it in the hands of that school committee, the district, to decide what to even raise taxes for, or levy, it's an automatic raise in my opinion, but to levy taxes for. It says non-core educational, I think that should be addressed also, activities and expenses, what does that mean?
I'd like to add, it seems like we're moving forward with the vote, but I'm opposed to the concept for entirely different reasons. I think the sort of balance of power between Foster and Gloucester, the issues that I see have more to do with, I was thinking of increased costs in terms of the cost administratively, but Kelly pointed out the increased costs that I think probably dwarf just the administrative costs of administering a separate tax district, but also the ability to increase on the town level taxes by 4%, independent of increases of taxes at the regional school district. I don't see the benefit to the taxpayers being able to do that. It seems like it's creating an opportunity where their taxes can probably would go up by more than 4%. Just they're now paying them to separate bodies. They're paying separate amounts to the region and to the town. So I'm not sure I see a real benefit to taxpayers by doing this.
Just real quick, I did my math when they were 50-some years ago, but if I look at simple numbers as Gordon was talking about, if the budget's 15 million, 10 million of it is the school, and 5 million of it is the municipality. If I took 4% of 10, and 4% of 5, okay, that comes out to 60,000. If I took 4% of 15, it's 60,000. So it's not gonna go up. You know, Mr. Savaggio said, oh, the budgets are gonna go up. But like I said, you know, maybe it's, I didn't learn the, you know, Common Core math where I had to write everything out. But I still think that the numbers hold. And I think on the municipal side though, again, if you take those to that scenario, that other number, 4% of that other number is always gonna be higher than whatever number we have on the municipal side. And that's the concern, and the concern there is, you know, at some point, and again, this is 18 months ago, raised the same issue, is that at some point, we're not gonna be able to levy enough to cover, you know, what all our needs are. And again, we need to sit down and discuss this as we started, whatever time it was, discussing.
And I think it's been worthwhile to have a discussion. It's worthy of a discussion. And hopefully we brought things to light that you see that could be potential problems that maybe you didn't realize. And similarly, you know, you've raised some issues that, you know, we might not have considered. See, when I looked at the synopsis of the bill that was being posted, it was a lot different. As again, when you get into the weeds, that was the problem. I was looking at it from the point of view of the way it was described as enabling. You didn't say, shall do this, that, and the other thing. Okay. That was what I saw. And that was the intent. When my initial comments was just enabling and not to get into the weeds. And if that bill, it defines some weeds that we don't agree with, we ought to just say no. And it does, obviously. So
Yeah, that cut right
take it
through
off
all,
the table.
through everything on the table.
Yeah, just do what you gotta do. But I think it was important we had a discussion, get to know each other.
I certainly appreciate that, getting together and discussing this. I think it was important. I do have some reservations because of the logistics of it. Some of the things that were brought out, I did meet with Kelly yesterday, yesterday?
Yes.
Yes, to discuss some of the concerns that were coming up. And so I would have some reservations about this resolution, or actually the bill more so.
Just real quick, and I hope the problem doesn't arise with you folks, and I hope it doesn't with us. This year was kind of close with that referendum, and I don't have the numbers with me, but from my recollection, there were actually 230 people that voted. However, there were 220 that voted on the overall budget. There were apparently 10 people that cast ballots that didn't vote for the budget. Budget passed by 22 votes. There were 66 people that voted against it. But when it came to the school question, about spending the money on the schools, there were, I believe it was a total of 230 that voted for it, and only 66 that voted against it. So that passed by a landslide from the same people that voted on the overall budget, 10 of which didn't bother, but that passed only by 22 votes. So it is a potential problem in the future. It's like Ted said earlier, if the budget hadn't passed, we'd have to scramble to cut the $338,000 or whatever the number is that we're already bound to pay to the region, the increase, and you folks as well. So, you know, where do you cut that kind of money in your municipal budget? And I know Dr. Barnes is modeling his 2% set aside for capital over both towns. But I respectfully submit that he doesn't have roads, police department, with trucks, DPW trucks and everything else to maintain that both of our towns do with that 2% capital set aside.
Any further comments or questions before we vote on this resolution? Hearing none, all those in favor of endorsing this resolution, signify by saying aye. All those opposed?
No.
Nay.
Nay.
Okay. That motion fails. unanimously. The resolution is not passed.
But I would like to say, I would like to continue these conversations.
Thanks for your time, appreciate it.
So we do have some common ground on the first resolution. And we'll get it out as a future agenda item. We'll set that up, we'll craft some wording, and we'll let you know when we're gonna talk about it, so you can come if you like, or we can do it and send it on to you.
Let us know.
It should, I don't think it'll be that long, it'll be sometime. And I'll contact Chippendale and Kettle, if you can contact your reps. Just tell them that one we're against and the other one we're,
Okay.
thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
We're gonna take a 5-minute recess.
Those have-